guessed it, I'm going to talk about the Rachmaninov Prelude again today, but from a slightly different point of view than a practice session. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about note reading, and specifically a type of note reading called intervallic note reading. So, not making any assumptions, I'm going to give you a very brief, very quick rundown of how the stave works, so that you have a bit of context for what I'm going to describe in the couple of bars of the Rachmaninov Prelude that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so here is my trusty manumat, which is produced by Black Rock Music. It's where I buy a lot of my books and sheet music. And it's a really, really useful tool for introducing people to understanding how the stave works. So we've got all of these perspex, little bits of plastic with all the notes and clefs. So we've got the 5 parallel lines at the top and 5 parallel lines underneath. So at the top is for the right hand, and the bottom stave is for the left hand, and in order to identify them we have things called clefs. So this symbol is called the treble clef, and it's most often associated with the right hand. This is the bass clef associated with the left hand because of the portion of the piano that it represents. It will make more sense in a bit. So every single line and every single space corresponds to one white key on the piano. So in terms of the treble clef stave, that represents 9 different white keys. And similarly down here on the bass clef stave, that represents 9 different white keys. There are obviously many more white keys than 18 in total, but I'll explain about that in a minute. It's just showing you a snapshot of the keys on the piano. This is just a type of note. This is called a semi-breve. It lasts for 4 beats. It's for simplicity that we're not using the ones with the stems yet. So in terms of learning where to start, basically, we've got a couple of landmark notes that we start with. So for the treble clef, it is the note that's on the second line up from the bottom, and this is what we call treble G. This particular G is the G above middle C. So middle C being the C in the middlemost part of the piano, and then G directly above it, 5 notes above it, sorry, is your treble G. Now, in order to understand how the stave works, we've got a directional aspect. So if you imagine it's kind of like a ladder, when you climb up the ladder, you're going up to the right on the piano. You're going up in pitch when you go up this way. And then when you go down the ladder, you're going down to the left on the piano, down in pitch. So to go from one note to the very next note on the piano, just talking about white keys, you go up into the very next space. So we go from a line, treble G, to the very next space. This is A, and then we can carry it on. The very next line is B, the very next space is C. Now these are all going up stepwise, and that's called, the distance between these 2 notes is called an interval of a second. If we take that one away, the interval between these 2 is an interval of a third, and so on. Interval of a fourth, interval of a fifth, and they're getting further and further apart on the stave, and they're getting further and further apart on the piano. Okay. In the bass clef, we have our landmark note that we start with is called bass C, and it's down here in the second space up from the bottom. Bass C is 1 C below middle C, so 1 octave below middle C, and you know, things work exactly the same way on the bass clef stave. If you want to go stepwise up from bass C, a step up from C alphabetically is D, so this is our D, which is 1 step up, and then another step up, or another second up as it's called, is E and F and G and so on. Okay, so after that very basic explanation of how the stave works, and how, you know, going up and down is our directional reading, I wanted to explain how you apply that to a piece of music. Now, it doesn't matter how basic or how complicated it is. this method is how musicians read music and play music, particularly when you're playing music on the piano, is looking for the distance between the notes. Now, a very reasonable assumption in the beginning when you're learning to read music is that you need to learn every single note on the stave and how it relates to the piano, which is a fair assumption to make. It's very logical, but in practice, when you're reading music and playing music at the piano, no way are you seeing every note and, you know, in your head or otherwise acknowledging that's A, C, E, F, B, G, you know, whatever chords you're playing. You know where you start, and then all you're doing is looking for how much higher up or down am I going from note to note and in each hand, and, you know, whether it's single notes or chords. So this is the perfect example for just because I'm working on this prelude at the moment. That's exactly what I'm doing in the, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Bars 7 and 8, which these two bars here. There's a lot of notes. Every single half beat, bar the first one, has 6 notes in it, 3 in each hand. And at first glance, you might think you've got to work out 6 notes every single time, but that's not the case at all. So what's going on is, well, there's several things going on. One thing is this piece is in the key of C sharp minor, which means it has 4 sharps, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp, which are black keys on the piano. And there's several things that come into play when you're reading music, especially that's in C sharp minor. One is that you need to be familiar with the key of C sharp minor, and by that I mean all the notes that belong in that key, and this is where scales come in. So scales is a whole separate topic that I could talk a long time about, that would probably be a bit boring. So just to give you a brief understanding of them, it's like I said, it's all the notes that belong in a particular key. And you practice scales when you're learning to play the piano for several reasons. It gives you lots of practice at moving your fingers quickly and evenly and accurately. And so here's an example of the C sharp minor scale. So when I'm learning a new piece, I will always play the scale and the arpeggio in the key of that piece to get me into the key of that piece, i.e. which sharps or flats and white notes are involved. So when it comes to reading the music in these particularly heavy bars, heavy meaning lots of notes, lots and lots of notes within only 2 bars, is spotting from one beat to the next which direction the notes are going, and any patterns. So music is full of patterns, and being able to spot the patterns even in chords is really useful, particularly for this. So I don't know how easy it is to see from here, but if we take the right hand, so this is the treble clef stave, the right hand in the second half beat of the bar, we've got 3 notes directly above each other, which means they're played as a chord, all 3 at the same time. Now the bottom one is treble G. That's actually one of the landmark notes that I talked about earlier. So the bottom one is treble G, except it's a G sharp in this case because of the key signature. And the distance from that note to the very next one above it is a 5th. Now, I know it's a 5th because I've seen lots of music for lots of years, but learning these intervals, the distance between the notes, is something that gets more and more familiar the more music you look at. So we've got a 5th above that, but actually the first thing I would notice is the top note of this chord is an octave away. So it's both G's, and then in the middle you have a D. Now, I've identified the names of those 3 notes. When you move from that first chord to the very next one, you can look at each note head and spot that each one only moves up by an interval of a second. Each one moves exactly the same distance up the stave, which may not be clear from this distance, but it does. So instead of reading another 3 notes, all I do is move my hand one note up, but keeping the same distance between the fingers. So that's the process, that's what you do, and that is how you're able to read this kind of music much more quickly than you would do if you tried to identify every single note. In the left hand, for the bass clef, we have almost the same thing going on. We've still got octave chords, but we have a third above the bottom, which is just skipping a note on the white keys. Obviously, we've got F sharp, C sharp, G sharp and D sharp to remember as well, so they won't always be the white keys. But it follows the same pattern. It mimics the same thing in the left hand. So both your hands are moving in the same direction by the same amount, going from that first chord to the second chord in that particular bar. So, I hope I haven't confused you. But now I'll show you a clip of those two bars. Bear in mind, these notes are very close together and there is some overlapping between the hands, which makes it look a little bit more complicated. But hopefully you can listen and hear the direction of the notes and also see that my hands are pretty much moving the same distance each time. Yeah, okay, so on with the clip. So hopefully I haven't confused everybody. If you got anything useful out of this video, that's great. I realise this is actually quite a complicated piece of music, but the point of the video is to show that it doesn't matter how complicated the music is, you use exactly the same principles for note reading and playing in real time. And we always go for the most efficient way, which, 30 years ago was not the most efficient way. That was learning things like mnemonics for all the lines and spaces on the treble clef and bass clef stave. And that's fine, it does work, but it's a little bit slower. But the intervallic note reading and landmark notes is, I believe, the way forward, and actually a much more efficient and more logical way of reading the staff and, the stave. That's the American terminology. Reading the stave, and therefore being able to read music fluently.